My name's Siobhan MacDonald and I work for Scottish Agricultural College, and I'm here on behalf of the Farm Advisory Service. And I'd like to introduce Audrey Litterick, who's also known as Mrs. Compost. So Audrey has been working in horticulture for 45 years now, since the age of 12.
And you're so kind, Siobhan.
And she used to work in SEC as a nutrient specialist, and now she does lots of reclamation of land while working for her own business, which is very well respected. And she has done loads of work on compost and composting and is an avid grower herself. So I will pass over to Audrey. If you've any questions throughout, just put them in the chat, and we'll, unless they kind of are appropriate at that time, and I'll just interrupt Audrey, but I'll keep a lookout for questions and we'll try and get through all of them at the end as well. So just put them in if that helps you not forget them.
Right, what we're going to be talking about tonight: compost and growing media. Definitions for a start, differences and descriptions. So we'll start with composts and composting, how composting works, a bit about how to make good composts and what to use the compost that you make for. And then we're going to talk about growing media, to make or to buy, what it means to go peat-free, which is, I guess, what we should all be doing now, the reasons for that, choosing growing media if you're going to be buying it, and then, oh dear, making growing media, the pros and cons of doing that, and also some do's and don'ts. So why is there a bit of a confusion? Because there is confusion. In the UK, and we're the only country in Europe, as far as I know, the only country in the world that does this, we have two meanings for the word compost. It's got two completely different meanings. And a lot of people don't fully understand the differences between the two. The result of that is confusion and mistakes, poor germination and growth of young plants, heartache, crop loss and financial losses. And I've had all of these this year myself without a shadow of a doubt. And it can be problematic. So we'll start by looking at one of the definitions for the word compost. And I call it true compost, because this type of compost is made through a composting process. And the picture there on the left of your screens is a proper compost, or a true compost, if you like. So it's a stable, sanitized organic material made from organic wastes. And it's made by a composting process. It's not lots of different stuff mixed together afterwards in a bag. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a stable, sanitized organic material made from organic wastes by a composting process. And it's a magical material, garden compost. Not necessarily garden, of course, it can be made commercially, but garden composts can be, or certainly not always, but can be some of the best soil conditioners that you could get, rich in a wide range of beneficial bugs and microorganisms, and suitable for use as a fertilizer, soil conditioner, a top dressing for your grass, for turf. Only the very best composts are suitable for inclusion as a constituent of a growing medium. I'll speak about that in a minute. But the benefits of using compost, whether you're buying in compost from a commercial compost production facility, or you're making your own in your garden, the benefits of using them, these type of composts in agriculture or in field horticulture, are very extensive, very well known, and well documented. So what actually is composting? Well, by that I mean it's a controlled process. It's probably a bit less than very well controlled if you're a gardener. Some gardeners manage to get away with doing very little to their compost during the actual process, but the commercial processes are really quite well regulated. They're written down in a standard operating procedure, and the people that manage them do the same things every single time, and they use the same mixture of feedstocks or starting materials every single time. So those big commercial processes, like the one at the top there, they're controlled, but they're also, like all good composting processes, they happen with oxygen. So they're aerobic processes, happen with oxygen. and it's completely biological process. So it's done by microorganisms. So it's a biological decomposition of organic materials such as garden wastes and food wastes. And you get the process to start through mixing the materials together, making sure there's plenty air in there, plenty moisture in there, and you get self-generated heating happening naturally. So you can do it either in open windrows like the one above, or sort of semi-enclosed systems. This is my garden one. We've got several bins on the go at any one time. Fill one up gradually over a period of weeks or even months, and then you decide, right, that's it, that's all I'm adding. And we would normally cover the top. Say a bit more about that later. So that's a sort of semi-enclosed system. So that's one meaning for the word compost. The other meaning is that the word compost can also mean a growing medium. In other words, a substrate used to sow seeds or start strike cuttings in, or to pot on young plants, or actually to grow fruit and vegetables and salads in. And the UK gardening media, people on television and radios and in the gardening magazines, they'll use the word compost to mean that. Sorry, I don't want these. That's it. They'll use the word compost to mean growing medium. And because they use the word compost is used kind of interchangeably, many people believe that you can use garden compost to sow seeds in and to strike cuttings in, and that's absolutely not the case. The two types of compost, in other words, what I call true compost made by a composting process, and growing media, are totally different things. They're absolutely not interchangeable. They might look the same, but they're not the same. So what about a definition of a growing media then? Growing media are manufactured by blending different constituents to get tailor-made products for specific uses. So we might be sowing seeds or striking cuttings, potting on young plants, potting on older plants, or we might be growing greedy feeders such as vegetables and fruit, for example, or growing ericaceous plants, and that's because they like acid soils or acid media. It's a different sort of medium that you might buy for that purpose. So what constituents might be in growing media then? Well, peat was formerly the absolute tops. It was the major bulk constituent that would be used in growing media since about the 1970s or round about then. Nowadays, usually, I would say, not always, usually in amateur growing media, you'll get other things, and in professional growing media, well, maybe some, but not necessarily. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. So peat, coir, and that's wastes from coconut production, composted bark, composted wood fibre, sterilised heat-treated wood fibre. That's one of the best things you can use actually as a peat replacement. And then to a lesser extent, there's other things, usually at lower volumes. So top quality, specially produced, past 100 accredited. That means it's accredited through the UK Compost Quality Accreditation Scheme. Green compost, which means it's made from garden wastes, basically. Sterilised loam or natural topsoil. The loam is basically a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Coarse sand, even some gravel. Unsterilised loam, that's a pretty dangerous thing to do for all sorts of reasons, because quite often it can contain plant pathogens. Perlite or vermiculite, which is kind of expanded clay minerals. I'm sure you'll be familiar with that. And other types of expanded clay minerals like zeolite, for example. All of those things can be used. Oops. So the physical and chemical properties of a good growing medium, in other words, one that's going to be good at striking cuttings, provide a great place for your plants to grow. Physical and chemical properties of a good growing medium are absolutely critical to its safety, as far as human safety is concerned, and also its performance as far as a plant growing medium is concerned. So why can't we just use garden compost as a growing medium? Because after all, they pretty much look the same, and they do to a large extent look the same. When you feel them and when you smell them, a good garden compost is a lovely thing, and it can look quite similar. It's the chemistry is totally different, and the physical properties are totally different between the two. So garden composts are extremely variable. from year to year, from season to season, and also depending what you put into them and how you make them. But they're generally too salty. I don't mean table salt, sodium chloride type salt. I just mean the salts of plant nutrients. Too many nutrients in there, too nutrient rich. They'll quite often burn the roots of emerging seeds and seedlings. Also, they've got too much ammonium nitrogen often, especially if your garden composting process is not really quite complete, and that'll burn the roots. They can sometimes have what's called a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So immature composts have got too much carbon in them in relation to nitrogen. That's a really important property to understand, and it's one that many commercial growing media manufacturers are getting wrong. That's a principal reason for commercial amateur growing media, bag growing media, for being rubbish, is because there's too much carbon in relation to the nitrogen that's in them, and plants just will not grow well if that's the case. Garden composts are often physically unsuitable as well. They're too fine or too coarse. They hold too much water or not enough. They drain too quickly or too fast. They don't let enough air in, or they let too much air in. So they're quite often physically not that good. And the other thing is garden composts often contain weed seeds, plant pests, and plant pathogens as well. So I'm going to look in a bit more detail now at both composting and compost use, and then we'll look at growing media. So looking at composting first, well, some people feel that, oh, it's too scientific, they'll never get a grasp of it. Others feel that, well, it's a bit of a dark art and probably they'll never get to grips with good composting. Well, I think you can be a scientist or have very green fingers and make a brilliant job of composting, but there is a bit of work in it. So lots of different types of systems, from big, fully commercial systems. Quite often the commercial systems will be in vessel, in other words, they're completely enclosed, and that's the law if you're composting food waste, commercial food waste. But for small growers, the best types usually involve just having 3 or 4 simple, very simple, unturned or turned. I'm going to suggest to you that you should be turning it, but turned piles or windrows of garden wastes, usually covered, not always, and usually partly enclosed. So how does it actually work? Composting is an incredibly complex process, but you don't need to know all the different complexities of it. You just need to know a few things. It's totally dependent on the kind of microorganisms that breathe air in the way that we do. So it's not an anaerobic process like you get a decomposition process in the middle of a static dung heap. It's completely aerobic. And the bugs that do it live naturally on in the environment and on most organic materials. There is no need, absolutely no need, to be buying any fancy preparations or starter cultures or anything for your composting process. If you've got everything right, you shouldn't need that. And it probably won't help you anyway if you still haven't got the conditions right. So if you've got enough moisture, enough oxygen, the bugs that are present will begin to break down the organic materials in a newly formed compost heap. And as time goes on, these bugs produce heat as they breathe and multiply. And that heat completely naturally is produced, it builds up, and the species of microorganisms that do the job of the composting process naturally begin to change as the heat builds up, and then they change again and get reinvaded, particularly by fungi and eventually by worms as well as the compost cools down. So how does it actually work? Well, you need various things. This is basically a simplified diagram of what's happening. In the middle there, you've got mixed green wastes, garden wastes, if you like, and vegetable wastes. To get the whole process to happen, you need oxygen, you need water, and the bugs, microorganisms, should be there by themselves. And during the process, you'll get water given off as the organisms in there breathe. You'll get carbon dioxide given off as any aerobic respiration will do. You'll also get quite a considerable amount of heat, and you'll get, hopefully, compost of some quality at the end of it. It's the natural heating in the compost pile that's absolutely vital to the whole thing. And this is the difference between good compost and poor compost. So garden compost heaps can actually be really pretty cool. And that's because you're not getting it quite right. What you're trying to do is make sure that you get as much heat as possible in the middle of the pile, and then you turn it to get the cooler outer bits into the middle, and then they'll heat up. And it's that natural heating which kills plant pathogens, animal pathogens, weed seeds and weed roots, denatures viruses, and also helps to break down any contaminants that might be there, particularly pesticides, although most people nowadays are using very, very few, if any, pesticides. Now, this is just a diagram explaining how you get that heat. These are the things you need to do to make sure that you get it as hot as possible. 3 things are important: the structure of the wastes that you're putting in, the moisture content, or the air-water balance, if you like, and also this thing I've mentioned before, the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So carbon is basically present in large quantities in woody materials, paper, cardboard. Nitrogen is present in larger quantities in green fleshy materials, things like lawn clippings, tree and shrub, green prunings, vegetable wastes. And you need a good balance of those, a good approximately 50-50 mix of each. But that's very, very approximate. And you need to get it kind of, well, about 40 to 60% moisture content, but not too wet, not too dry. All this is to do with feel. So the structure needs to be fairly open, but not too open. Open enough to let moisture penetrate and also let air penetrate and not sit too wet at the bottom. Every compost heap will sit too wet at the bottom. That's why you have to turn it, to keep the moisture kind of even throughout the whole pile. If your heap's getting too wet, you need to cover it with a waterproof, breathable, ideally breathable membrane. And if it gets too dry, you should be watering it literally with a garden hose. And it's basically fuel. That's what gets you there. Most feedstocks or starting materials are not any use on their own. So fleshy, wet, green material like what you see on the top there will need mixed with chunky, well-structured, woody material. In other words, high carbon feedstocks will need mixed with high nitrogen materials. Do be prepared to put in time and effort. Making good compost does not happen by accident. You do need to assess these things that I've mentioned. You definitely do need to be turning it at least once, but I would try and encourage people to test it, to turn it at least twice, if not 3 times. I think I've mentioned this already, so move on. Ensure that enough air gets in, but not too much. And if the wastes are too coarse, shred them or make the heap bigger. We put our hedge clippings in, but they all do get shredded first. When you shred things quite coarse, quite small, using a garden shredder, there's a tendency for the heap to heat up very, very quickly, which is good, but you also need to look at turning it probably as much as a couple of times in the first 2 or 3 months. And then you'll make much faster compost than you will if you don't turn it. Try to achieve temperatures in the middle of your heap of at least 60 degrees. That's the kind of temperature that will basically kill plant pathogens, weed seeds, weed propagules, and so on. Not everybody gets that, and not everybody gets it after turning once or twice, but it's a good aim. And you should aim to compost all materials for at least 6 months, ideally 12 months if you can. And don't add any new material to the heap in at least the last 4 months. And it's also worth bearing in mind that for some applications, you need to sieve the compost through a coarse garden sieve before you use it, particularly if you're going to be brave enough to use it as a constituent of your own homemade growing medium. This is what you should be using garden compost and can be using garden compost for. Fertilizer it contains lots of really good nutrients. So it contains NPK, not so much nitrogen actually. Garden compost is not a great nitrogen fertilizer, but lots of phosphate, potash, sulfur, magnesium, and lots of trace elements. I've just had mine tested and it's fairly similar to a good quality farmyard manure, but there's lots of good beneficial microorganisms in it as well, and that makes it a bit different. So it's a soil conditioner too. It's got loads of organic matter in it, and it's great for helping to develop soil structure and improve the health of your soils. You can use it as a lawn top dressing if it's sieved. You can also use the coarse fraction of the compost as a mulch around fruit trees, for example, or to keep weeds down in shrub borders. It can be very good at that. And if you're very brave, you can use your own garden compost as a constituent of growing media. I would suggest, I'll probably say this a couple of times, I would suggest be very careful doing that. It's not an easy thing to do. Probably play safe and use it particularly for mixing a growing medium to use to grow nutrient-hungry vegetable and salad crops, the less sensitive things, for example, like potatoes and well-grown vegetable transplants. You really should still be diluting it with other low nutrient materials though. No. So let's have a look at growing media now. What to consider when you're looking to buy some. Well, for a start, what are you going to be using it for? A growing medium is not normally a growing medium. You do get multi-purpose growing media, of course, as we all know, but they're always a bit of a compromise, and they're not usually ever quite as good as one that's actually been made for a specific purpose. So seed sowing media tend to have lower nutrient content, which is good. Lower or next to no nutrient content, because any amount of salt, nutrient salts in a seed, in a propagation medium, is likely to restrict rooting to an extent. So a multi-purpose compost would normally, growing media should really say, a multi-purpose growing media quite often has very low nutrient levels in it, or it simply won't be that great as a seed sowing medium. So you really are better to buy one that's specifically for propagation. So you might have a seed sowing compost, one for potting on young plants, older plants, very mature plants, and maybe an ericaceous one in particular. So the John Innes composts do that. John Innes composts were developed at the John Innes Centre in Nottinghamshire a way back, and they contain, I think it's coarse sand, sterilised loam, and peat, and a sort of base nutrient content of, I think it's triple superphosphate and hoof and horn for nitrogen and some potash as well. So there's the seed sowing one, and then there's John Innes 1, 2, 3, and then there's the ericaceous compost. So there's this recognition with that system that you do need a different growing medium for different purposes. So specific use is one thing to consider. The peat content is another. I don't know whether everybody will realise this, but John Innes compost traditionally contained a fair bit of peat. That was a major constituent in John Innes compost. And a lot of John Innes composts sold now are not anything like the original recipe of John Innes composts. Some of them contain peat, some of them don't, and sometimes when they say with added John Innes, all that really means is that they've added some loam, some sterilised loam, which is fine, but it's not technically correct to say that there's added John Innes in it, because that means there's added peat. So if it's a peat-free compost with added John Innes, that's not actually correct. Anyway, peat content. Formerly, most growing media from the 1970s onwards were either 100% based on peat or virtually 100% with some added fertilizers. That's not the case now, and we'll go on to talk about that a bit more in a minute. Loam content. Some growing media nowadays have loam in it. Can be a good thing. It does make things very heavy. It does make the media very heavy. And really it should be sterilised loam. Unless some of you are considering, and it's a slightly different case with tree production, because I've heard of several people who are making their own growing media or adapting their own growing media by putting unsterilised loam in it. Now, I wouldn't normally do that, but there is a case where you're deliberately including natural soil from forests. You can win some, you can lose some. Sometimes that means you inadvertently bring in pathogens or disease, but you can also end up bringing in mycorrhizal fungi, which can give the trees a very good start. You certainly need to be considering whether to bring in mycorrhizal fungi by some means when growing on young trees for community woodland schemes, for example, or large-scale native forests. Quality and performance, oh dear, I mean, there's some absolutely terrible growing media out there just now. Now that we're in the world of reduced peat growing media and peat-free growing media, there's some absolutely appalling products out there, particularly on the amateur market. But there are some very good ones too. We need to talk about that. Sustainability. People imagine peat's bad, everything else is good. It's unfortunately very far from the truth. Peat's bad by all accounts, and we need to be moving away from that entirely as far as growing media is concerned. But the sustainability of some of the alternatives is pretty bad. I don't like naming names, but I will name names here. There's one company called the Greener Gardening Company, which sounds very sustainable, but they're obtaining their wood fiber to make their growing media from the other side of the world. So, you know, it's coming from America, from North America. So a lot of the growing media companies are participating in what's called the Sustainable Sourcing Scheme, which means that they're trying to actually carbon footprint their work and okay, phase out peat, but don't phase in lots of other extremely unenvironmentally friendly constituents. So we've got to think about sustainability too. Reputation, what brands are good, what brands are not, and what different growing media within a brand are good and what are not. That's a minefield, so I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And then cost. Basically, you've got to expect that a good growing medium is going to cost you quite a lot of money and frankly quite a lot more nowadays in the future than it was before. Peat was cheap and the alternatives are quite expensive, but consider well, certainly what happened to me this year, and I know at least one other person in the audience who's had similar problems. If you buy a rubbish growing medium and your seedlings fail, you're not just losing the cost of that growing medium, you're also losing the cost of all the seeds that you've bought, and your production's put back quite seriously. So cost is a factor, but the most expensive growing medium is not necessarily the most expensive if it's really good. So why is peat been so much used? Well, it's worked so well because it's very cheap. It's also been widely available in sufficient quantities. It's got a really good, stable, open structure, and you get different types for different purposes. Very fine peats for propagation, very coarse peats for long-term big things like trees. It's effectively pretty much sterile, so it's free from plant pathogens and pests. The peat from a single bog that a growing medium manufacturer would be using is very, very consistent. It's also, and therefore, easy to formulate consistent growing media. Peat's acid, so it's very easy to lime it to whatever pH you want. It's almost nutrient-free. So again, you can add, you don't need to do much testing because you can add whatever nutrients you want and get something that you understand. So peat's been so useful for so long, but why do we need to go peat-free? Because peat's a finite resource, and because our peat bogs are a very valuable store for carbon. We recognise that more than ever now, and using it is unsustainable and it's contributing to climate change. There are now some, I would say some, certainly not all, but there are some very good peat-free growing media. And also, let's get real, peat use in amateur horticulture is shortly to be banned. And in commercial horticulture, it will eventually be banned too. So we need to get our acts together. We've been talking about peat-free media for long enough. We do need to be getting on with it. So here's a more complex question. Can you do this one, Siobhan, please? Well, firstly, I'm not going to blame anybody for using peat-based. I used peat-based media for some of my stuff this year because I had got so scunnered with an absolutely appalling product, which I lost. I think I must have wasted almost £100 on a really bad peat-free product, along with all the seeds that I lost as well. And the only thing I could get at short notice to replace all the stuff that I'd lost was a peat-based medium, and it was absolutely terrific. But through choice, I would be using peat-free. And the ones that I've used in the past have been very, very good. So most commercial growers, and I would say it's fair to say most commercial growers continue to use peat-based growing media. I'll explain why that might be. So making peat-free growing media is difficult. Some commercial growing media companies are completely failing to produce good quality growing media that's peat-free year on year, particularly in the amateur market. The situation is slowly improving, and there are now some really good products out there. But why are so many of them so awful? Well, it's because alternative constituents other than peat are much less consistent. And where you get this lack of consistency, if you want to produce a stable, reliable, good quality product that's consistent across your whole product label, then you've got to do a lot more testing. And that testing is really expensive. All growing media manufacturers try to minimize the cost of testing because the margins are so tight making growing media. One of my friends was a technical director of Bulrush Horticulture for many years, and he used to get so upset that, you know, the likes of B&Q and the other big sheds have driven the price of growing media down so much that the cost of the bag was actually, you know, to the consumer, the cost of the bag was actually more than the cost of the product inside it. So by the time you'd paid the bag and the transport and the storage, the value of the growing media in the bag was far, far less than that, a few pence, whereas the customer was paying about $5.99 a bag, and most of that was actually going into the printing, the bag design, the plastic, the wrapping, the distribution, and the haulage, and the storage. There's also an acute shortage of good quality growing media constituents, especially wood-based ones. So the price of wood products has rocketed in the past few years. And the main reason for that is because of the subsidies associated with the biomass renewable power sector. So that's not going to continue forever, neither should it, but so the value of timber at the moment is through the roof because of that sector, and growing media manufacturers simply cannot compete for their share of the wood fibre that goes into growing media. So why is peat use still continuing in the commercial horticulture sector? They largely still use it because they're used to it, they know how to handle it, they know how to use it to best effect. It's still cheaper for them. They perceive peat-based compost to be better, and frankly, they often are. Not always nowadays, there's some really good products out there. Their production methods are going to have to change if commercial growers go peat-free. It's a learning process. And there's been no UK ban to date for commercial growers, so there will be, so they're going to have to go down that route. And the other painful truth is, and many of you are using peat-based media, and I did this year too, the quality of amateur peat-free and reduced peat media is poor. So there's still this continued use for peat. For those who are using reduced peat and peat-free, even the very best brands and types really need to be used with care and a recognition that they'll behave differently. And probably most of us who've gone from peat to reduced peat media or peat-free find that watering's trickier. I quite often find that it's difficult to look at the surface of a pot and know whether it's wet or dry. Sometimes it's dark and you think it's wet and actually it's crusty and bone dry. And sometimes the reverse is true. Sometimes they hold far more water than peat-based media. It's a learning process to work out how to get the best out of them. But the good media are worth persevering with. Watering is likely to become a more skilled job, I believe. I think this is probably the last poll. How would you rate the quality of the bagged compost or growing media that you buy? I would say I used to be able to say consistently excellent because I used professional media, which was from Bulrush Peat Company, and it really was consistently excellent. It did whatever I bought, whether it was for a large scale, I did quite a lot of stuff with potting on large things like trees and nursery stock. And I had young plant stuff as well. Absolutely consistent and consistently excellent. Whereas with the stuff I'm using now, I would agree, variable and often poor, sadly. Yeah, that's a bit of a nuisance, but there we go. That's as it is at the moment. So how to make sure that you buy good growing media then? It's getting good growing media is absolutely crucial. If your entire production depends on it, which mine did. I mean, I don't grow crops for money, but we are pretty much self-sufficient, and I do give quite a lot of stuff away. So my whole year's production depends on really good growing media in the first instance. The most important thing is don't assume that a brand which worked for you last year will be as good as next year. That's what happened to me. I made that mistake. It was great last year and the year before, and this year the same company produced a product with the same label, and it was absolutely appalling. And that is quite common. You just need to look at the Gardening Which amateur growing media test results, which come out once a year, and quite often it's a different product that's at the top and different brands that are at the bottom year on year, although that is changing a bit now. Get recommendations from others if possible, if they've got in there before you and they've already tested stuff or used stuff. So colleagues, friends, other people in your local growing organisation, if anybody's used it, good. If there's time, try and get hold of a few different types and actually run seed germination tests. I did that, but too late this year, unfortunately. I didn't get mine till late on. But if you can get them at the back end of the year and do your simple germination tests, you don't need a lot of light. You're looking at just simple germination tests to see what germinates and grows in a small way, and test out your media and see which works and which doesn't. I also look at Gardening Which. That's really for amateur gardeners rather than for commercial growers using commercial growing media. But Gardening Which comes out, I think it's either the end of the year or the beginning of the next year, and they'll rate products. They rate peat-based growing media, reduced peat, and peat-free. And they use the same set of test guidelines. And the peat-based ones do usually come up top. I'm afraid that's life. But I do believe that if you get used to using the best peat-free and reduced peat, you'll get very good results. This year, I'm not going to at this stage say which ones came out top, but one of them I've had access to this year, and it was very good indeed. A bit now about making your own growing media. I would not recommend it, especially for commercial growers, particularly the most difficult. In other words, making the growing media that's most hangs-on, really, which is your propagation medium. Most hangs on it because it affects your whole production season, and also it's the most tricky one to make because you don't want any pathogens in it. You don't want much in the way of salts. You want it to be a really good place for seed germination to happen. Your media might look great, but you don't know what the chemistry is, and the chemistry is so, not without testing it, and that chemistry is so important, particularly for seed sowing media and also for young plants. So we're worried about the pH, the acidity, alkalinity, the saltiness, particularly the presence of ammonium, nitrogen, carbon to nitrogen ratio, the lack or an excess of one or more nutrients, and also this plant disease worry. So I hope I've said enough here to put you off. But if you are going to do it, if you're determined to do it, aim first only to produce growing media for growing on robust species of transplants and for growing greedy vegetables in containers, particularly potatoes and brassicas. And a second point, when making growing media, you've got to dilute nutrient-rich garden compost with coarse, open structured, nutrient-poor material. Peat's the perfect medium to do that with, but of course we shouldn't be using that. So you're then looking at coir, wood fibre, I've put a star there, I'll explain why in a moment, coarse sand and perlite. You can also use materials such as leaf mould, chopped bracken, problems associated with that because it's very high in carbon, topsoil and composted bark, but these things should ideally only form a small percentage. If there's becomes a commercial source of sterilised wood fibre, that would be a game changer for amateurs and small scale growers wanting to mix their own. growing media, but I don't know of one at the moment. Melcourt produced a fantastic material called Silva fibre, which is their own wood fibre, for sale, but they're not selling it anymore because they absolutely desperately need all of it themselves to make their own growing medium. If you're using your own growing medium, watch your growing crops with care. Realize and understand that you'll probably have to start supplementary feeding with liquid feeds during the growing season in order to get proper yields, decent yields. And finally, if your early experiments do go well, and you're making good media for, say, growing potatoes in containers and veg in containers, and you decide to start making media for seed production, test every batch with small-scale growing trials before risking using it widely. So to conclude, true composts made from garden wastes through a really well-designed and well-run composting process are really, really valuable in the garden, but they're very different from the other meaning for composts, growing media. If you understand the difference between what I call true composts and growing media, the two different types of composts, if you understand the difference between the two and how to get the best from both types, then your gardening business or croft or garden will be much the better for it. So there's some more information there. On the FAST website, there's going to be a new leaflet on this very subject. It's not been published yet. There's a bit of information in the Horticulture Handbook for Crofters, and there's some on the RHS webpage too. And
I'll maybe kick off by asking why aren't nutrients stated on bags of growing media or indeed bags of compost?
Well, they're not a fertilizer, so there's no legal requirement to declare fertilizer nutrients on in bags. And even when true compost is sold as a soil conditioner, that's not legally a fertilizer. And the reason for that, it's not a fertilizer because it's too inconsistent. So the UK fertilizer regulations, we're not part of the EU anymore, so we're not part of that thing, but we've got our own fertilizer regulations. And the UK fertilizer regulations state that there must only be a very limited deviation from a stated NPK value for a thing to be classed as a fertilizer. And composts are much, much too variable for that. So they're not classed as fertilizers. So there's no legal requirement to put it on the bag. And the other thing is, you wouldn't guarantee that in a growing medium, you wouldn't guarantee that all the fertilizer nutrients in that bag are going to become available to the plants that are growing in them, because it depends on how long the plants are going to be growing in the growing medium, and also depends on the moisture and temperature. So a lot of growing media, John Innes was different. John Innes composts have some organic fertilizer. They've got hoof and horn, and they've also got some potash and fertilizer, can't remember what it is, and sulfate of potash, I think, and also triple superphosphate. But most modern growing media have got what's called controlled release fertilizers, or resin coated controlled release fertilizers. And the trouble with putting the declaration of fertilizer on the bag is that your crop's not necessarily going to be getting all of that. Depends how long the crop is in the medium for. So it's so complicated that it would be liable to be inaccurate. So most bags of growing media simply say enough feed for 4 to 6 weeks. And that depends on how much, that depends on an average. It depends on how much the plants are growing. So a slowly growing plant in quite cool conditions would still be getting feed out of that bag 12 weeks later. Whereas a really gutsy thing like a potato would probably have the whole lot used up in 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
That's a kind of complicated answer to quite a complicated question.
Makes sense. That makes sense, yeah. So following on from that then is, Anne's asking, are there any standards for growing media other than the PAS 100 that you mentioned?
No.
Thanks for that answer.
No, and what's more, there's no legal requirement for the growing media manufacturer to tell you what's in it. which is very annoying for me because I'm trying to help several clients at the moment make commercial growing media, Scottish brands of commercial growing media. And what we're doing is testing to death lots of competitors' products. And we're having to try and guess what's in them. Some it's quite easy to tell, others it's not. And some are kind and honest enough to actually tell me. But for some, many of them hold something back. So they've got something that they believe makes their growing medium special, which it might be. But I don't always know what it is. So there's no legal requirement to declare what's in it. Most now are declaring the percentage of peat in it, but not all.
When you spread seaweed on outdoor vegetable patches, and then maybe later on that you put some compost on that is primarily dung based, I was wondering with regards to the properties, does, you know, will they maybe sort of cancel one another out if one's sort of quite acidic, or, you know, both are acidic, or?
No, both of them will acidify soil to an extent, unless your seaweed is from a shell sand beach and it's got quite a lot of shell sand in it, which some do. And that can actually have it can have a bit of an liming effect. Both of them are, it sounds really quite incredible, but both of them are remarkably similar in terms of their nutrient content, strangely enough. So if you analyze a seaweed, you'll find it contains quite similar amounts of NPK to a good garden compost and to a dung, strangely enough. So their average values can be quite similar, although their real values, if you test them, can vary a bit from that. But they're both great soil conditioners. A dung or a garden, well, a dung would normally slightly acidify the soil. A seaweed sometimes can, but not always, depending on whether it's from a shell sand beach. A garden compost, that depends how it's been made. Some composts have got a slight liming value, but in terms of the effect on pH, not normally very much, other than probably a slight acidification, but it depends on the properties of the stuff. Nutrients, well, compost, dung and seaweed will all add a bit of phosphate and quite a lot of potash normally, and a little bit of nitrogen. Nitrogen's the difficult one. It's usually in short supply for growers who are trying to be organic, use organic methods, and they're trying to avoid synthetic fertilizer nitrogen. That's the one that's usually in short supply. It's in short supply in most organic materials. So where you're wanting to get the crops that you'll have most problem with, that would be brassicas, which are very greedy. They want a lot of nitrogen, and that's the hardest nutrient to get. But not much more to say on it, other than the fact that these are all really great bulky organic fertilizers. They've got both, so seaweed, garden compost and dung, they've all got lots of organic matter in them, and they've got useful amounts of plant nutrients. Probably all of them will have trace elements, useful quantities of trace elements, as well as all the other nutrients.
Thank you. I'll continue to sling it about with great abandon.
Well, I wouldn't actually go overboard. I mean, my mum's one of the worst proponents of this. She's got far too much. We've got too many horses, and she puts dung on like a mulch. And the downside is when you put it on thick year on year on year, you'll end up with too much nitrogen in the system, and you'll get loads. The brassicas will thrive on that. They'll get loads and loads of green leafy growth, but the things that actually flower for a living, or flower to feed you, you'll get less flowers and less fruit and more pest and disease problems, lots of aphids particularly, and some of the rots as well. So there's rules about that which are in the Crofting Horticulture Handbook. And basically, normally, once your soil is at the stage where you've got good levels of P and K in it, you should actually only be putting on probably between 20 and 40 tons per hectare of bulky organic material. That means between 2 and 4 kilograms per square meter. So always bear that in mind. So gay abandon is good if your soils are really quite deficient, which many people soils are to start with. But once your soils start to get really nutrient rich, you don't want to be putting on excessive quantities of seaweed or dung. It's harmful for all sorts of reasons. Your crops won't do so well, you'll get nutrient imbalances, you'll get too much nitrogen in the system, you'll get more pest and disease attack, and you potentially could be polluting local water courses as well, because you'll start to get phosphate moving into your water courses, and problems with eutrophication and algal blooms and all sorts of things like that. People say, oh, I don't see that on crofts. Yes, you do. You definitely do. I've seen it on crofts. So gay abandon is good, but test your soils and find out where you are.
We have another question in, which is, you mentioned getting compost at the end of the season to test, but this person was under the impression that fresh compost should be purchased at the start of a new growing season.
Whoever asked it, you're absolutely correct, but growing media manufacturers are producing now for next year. You should always get fresh growing medium. You should not be using last year's. It's okay to use last year's if you mix it with a bit of the new stuff and you use it for, say, potato growing, or use it for less important things like, say, tubs and troughs of well-grown bedding plants, pot and bedding plants, that kind of thing. But for crucial purposes, definitely buy this year's growing medium. But remember that this year's growing, if you're buying it in say February, March, April, it's actually being made, 6 months before. The growing media manufacturers work for 12 months of the year, and they make it and store it and build it up and build it up and build it up, and the whole lot's dispatched, usually from probably the end of the year right through till April, May. I mean, it's very hard to get large quantities of growing media now because they're not selling next year's production yet.
I think
yes, you're absolutely right. Fresh is best.
And it's slightly different in the islands, Audrey, in that a lot of the suppliers get a huge stack in, and then that is what is there for the whole season. So
yeah,
if you're buying in November, it's old compost.
That's very, very difficult. Very difficult. And especially if I was on the island, what I would be looking to do would be get together with lots of other islanders and make an order in bulk to be delivered with, early in the year with the latest production of growing media. But then you don't know what you're buying because you haven't had a chance to test it. Very, very difficult. The only thing I would say is, and I'm going to say it now because I believe this company deserves a plug. The one that I'm finding is genuinely consistent is a company called Melcourt. I've got the utmost respect for the technical people behind the company. I've got no shares in the company, so I've got nothing to gain from this. But they really do seem to have their heads screwed on. They're kind of an honourable company as well. They produce for some absolutely top-class products for the commercial grower. They also produce a very nice product, which was top in the witch trials for peat-free. I think it's Melcourt Silva Compost or something it's called. If you were to do a bulk order, if you could get it, that is a very, very good product. And it's been consistently good for quite some time. The problem will be getting it because they say they just cannot get enough raw materials to make enough of their media to satisfy demand for next year. There's a acute shortage of alternative constituents.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay. Also, what about using cow manure in compost, or should you keep it separate?
In your own composting system, I take it this is, rather than in growing media. That's what I'm reading it as.
Yeah. Throw it in the compost heap or just keep it in its own pile. And use
no, I think it depends what else you've got in your compost heap. I've put it in mine, and I've also used sheep manure in mine and also horse manure. If you've got a lot of kind of woody material, too much woody material, winter hedge prunings, for example, which I have, too much carbon and quite coarse. If that's the case, then things like a small amount of poultry manure or a bit of a larger amount of dung can really change your whole process, and it can really get it heating up very well. That's the way to tell, really. If you can create a mix that heats fairly rapidly and you turn it and it heats rapidly again, you're onto a winner. So yeah, generally, yes. If you're trying to compost only cattle manure, that's quite a difficult thing to do. And you see the organic standards bodies, they suggest, I think they maybe ask that straw cattle manure is composted. It's a very difficult thing to do that. Very, very difficult. It's not true composting what they're asking the farmers to do. What they're really saying is, we request that you turn your cattle manure a couple of times. That's not composting. There's not enough air gets into the mix. Not enough air gets into the mix because the piles are too big, they're too high, and there's not enough turning happens. So it's a very difficult thing to compost cattle manure on its own because it's too wet, there's too much nitrogen in it, and its structure's all wrong. But if you're adding a bit of that to your compost heap and you're taking care to make sure there's plenty of air, it's not too wet, and there's enough carbon and enough open structure, it's a brilliant addition to the compost heap.
Okay, so the different problem is if we don't have much woody waste, but lots of leafy veg and weeds and food waste, should we be adding lots of shredded cardboard for our carbon nitrogen ratio?
Yes, yep, definitely. I have the same problems some of the year. I also have different problems at different times of year. The one thing that's quite easy to hold back is cardboard, paper, and woody waste. So my husband is very keen on woodwork, and so I've just been restoring a bothy on mull and come back with two bags of wood shavings, which I'm really can't wait to get into my compost heap. Because I've got this time of year, most people have got far too much green fleshy material and soft sludgy material. So the lack is that what you're talking about. So cardboard, shredded wood shavings, sawdust, all these things are good. But the finer and less structured material, you need to watch that it doesn't get too soggy and airless. So you have to watch and turn it if you can a bit as well.
Okay. Does pine, softwood-based wood chip cause allelopathic effects?
Not if it's really well composted. You do have to watch that. It makes a great mulch if it's fairly immature, and basically compost that's got that in it starts out with, it's got quite a lot of sort of terpenes and phenolics and oils and things in it. These will all break down over time. With something like that in your compost, you really have to leave it longer, but it does work particularly well as a mulch to stop weeds growing. So consider using it for that. And if you do want to actually dig it into the garden, providing you're running your composting process fairly well, you're doing at least one turn, ideally 2 or 3 to each heap, and leaving it at least 6 months with wastes like that, and you'd be looking to leave it a year. If you do that, you shouldn't have problems.
And what about coffee grinds? Are they carbon or nitrogen? And anything else to look out for with coffee grinds?
Coffee grounds are very rich in nitrogen. They're absolutely terrific. A wee bit like adding poultry manure or dung, very rich in nitrogen. The compost bugs absolutely love them for whatever reason. So be fairly sparing, but unless you're running a coffee shop, you know, you're not probably going to, oh, right, somebody is, right, okay. Yeah, if you're running a coffee shop, I wouldn't put tons in every day. If you're running a coffee shop, then make sure you add plenty of woody, high carbon wastes as well. But they really are good. There's something magical about coffee grounds. I'm not really very sure what, but the compost heap absolutely loves them.
So somebody's had a compost heap for about a year now. Should she leave it and start another?
Definitely. I would say the best thing to do is turn it, cover it with a bit of carpet, or if you can, I mean, the best stuff to cover a compost heap is actually a sort of, it's something called Top-Tex, which is a bit like Gore-Tex. You can tie a brick to each end and cover it off over the top, and it basically lets the compost breathe, but it's waterproof. So it doesn't let air, it doesn't let water in, but it lets air go in and out. That's the best possible thing. But a piece of carpet works pretty well unless you're in a really wet area. So if you're in an area with very high rainfall or a particularly wet time of year, it's better to cover it with a tarpaulin for part of the year, for the wettest part of the year, but only the top, not the sides. And that'll stop the worst of the water getting in. And what was the rest of that question?
That was the rest of that question.
Okay,
I think you've answered. Yeah, you're okay. So unless anyone has any more burning questions, I think we can round it up, and we can allow the poor folk in Uig to escape the midges.
Does look quite midgy out there.
You've done really, really well. You get the gold star for this evening, I think.
Perseverance.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. Oh, we do have another question. Sorry, we'll just do this one quickly. Is an important use of compost the inoculation of biology?
Well, the jury's really out on that one. I would say it is, but I don't have a tremendous amount of proof, really. I mean, you have, I don't know whether anybody's heard of a woman called Elaine Ingham. She puts, I mean, you think I'm Mrs. Compost. She classes herself in a whole world, and herself she classes in a whole different league.
Is she Queen Compost then?
She's the world queen of compost.
Okay.
I don't believe everything that Elaine Ingham says, but I do believe some of it. And she does believe that it's the contribution which good compost can make to soils is exquisite and unique and very, very important. I think it probably is, but the research evidence says it's a little bit less sure than that. So you can have a very microbially diverse compost with lots of microorganisms and lots of different species, and apply it to soil, and you don't see any more healthy crops. But I personally believe you probably will improve the health of your soils, but we just don't have all the methods to measure that yet. Elaine Ingham believes we do. I don't believe the results are widely interpretable yet. She says she can interpret it, but when I ask her for proof and where's the science, and she's not able to give me as much as I would like. But I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, and have you ever tested biodynamic compost? And I'll make that the very final question.
Yes, I have. Nutritionally, it's not any better or any worse than compost made using any other methods. There is definitely something in biodynamic farming, biodynamic agriculture. Some of the practices, I don't understand why they work, but they clearly do. Others I'm less sure about, but from my point of view, I'm not seeing enough evidence to show that it's any better but certainly not any worse either. And the whole system of biodynamic farming seems to work very, very well for the people who practice it and make the best of it. So it's definitely a viable system. It's not for everybody, but it's definitely a viable system.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Audrey. That was really good explanation. I learned loads. I hope everyone else did as well. And I think it's time to let the people escape from the midges. But we'll have a guidance note on compost and composting and growing media within the next couple of weeks. So you'll be able to download that, and I'll email everybody and let them know it's available. And if you've any last questions, do just get in touch with us, and we'll try our best to answer. So thank you very, very much for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to Audrey too.